Hi. This video addresses paragraphs 13 to 19 of Gildas's Ruin of Britain, which cover the end of the Roman Empire. Just as a spoiler, this section doesn't give us much by way of genuine historical detail, but it does help to reveal Gildas's biases. The important thing isn't what this section says about Britain, but rather what it says about Gildas. The next video will cover the interesting bit, where the Saxons are finally allowed to make an appearance. Okay, section 13 from the Williams translation. At length also as thickets of tyrants were growing up and bursting forth soon into an immense forest, the island retained the Roman name, but not the morals and law, nay, rather casting forth a shoot of its own planting, it sends out Maximus to the two Gauls, accompanied by a great crowd of followers, with an emperor's ensigns in addition, which he never worthily bore, nor legitimately, but as one elected after the manner of a tyrant and amid a turbulent soldiery. This man, though through cunning art rather than by valour, first attaches to his guilty rule certain neighbouring countries or provinces against the Roman power by nets of perjury and falsehood. He then extends one wing to Spain, the other to Italy, fixing the thrones of his iniquitous empire at Trier, and raged with such madness against his lords that he drove two legitimate emperors, the one from Rome, the other from a most pious life. Though fortified by hazardous deeds of so dangerous a character, it was not long ere he lost his accursed head at Aquileia, he who had in a way cut off the crowned heads of the empire of the whole world. Okay, so apparently thickets of tyrants were growing up, but it's entirely unclear when this was. He skipped over Carausius and Electus and hundreds of years, so maybe he's thinking about them or possibly later, but it seems to still be the formal period of Britain within the Roman Empire because he specifically says the island retained its Roman name. He kept the name but not the morals and law. Winterbottom translates it as customs and law, and the actual word is mores, which is a word we use in English, mores. This is actually a very important detail because it makes plain that Gildas is upset about the loss of Roman law and customs. This isn't a Christian loss, it's a loss of Romanitas, and the laws necessary for proper civic functioning. Gildas is often described as a Christian moralist, but I think that slightly misses the point. He is making a detailed Christian moral case, but it's making a detailed Christian moral case which effectively calls for the restoration of Roman law, customs, civics and order. He then finds a way to blame Britain for Magnus Maximus, calling him a shoot of its own planting. He can't quite say he's a Briton, because presumably he knows he isn't, and Gildas's general rule of thumb is that it's permissible to be extremely misleading, but not to outright lie. Incidentally, Gildas has skipped over the Great Barbarian Conspiracy of 368, and Maximus's defeat of the Picts and Scots in 381. Gildas is deliberately resequencing history. We don't know exactly what events he was aware of apart from those in Orosius, but we do know he's resequencing history. He doesn't use dates, so you can't accuse him of misdating, but he regards it as legitimate to present information in a very misleading order. It's clear that Gildas doesn't want to give Maximus any credit at all. My view is that it's no accident that Maximus is presented as a heroic figure in Welsh legend. It seems very likely that the Proto-Welsh of the West and North are already big fans of Maximus. Later they make all sorts of claims for him having appointed them to rule the North, and even having been a direct ancestor of the royal house of Powys. We can't know which of these claims were already extant when Gildas wrote, but I think this section suggests that the legitimacy of the northern and western rulers was probably in some way already derived from Magnus Maximus. We do need some sort of explanation after all for why Gildas is taking time out from his busy schedule to emphasise Maximus's inglorious end and even the fact he was a usurper. Gildas is correct about this, and he was even subject to damnatio memoriae by the Roman Empire. But from a British perspective, it's very unclear what was the difference between him rising up from the army and becoming emperor, and all the supposedly legitimate emperors who did exactly the same. Gildas's perspective is that of the Roman Empire itself, not the British perspective. Interestingly, Orosius, who as I say we know to be a Gildas source, does cover Maximus, and the contrast is informative because Orosius says, when he introduces him, the army in Britain proclaimed Maximus emperor against his will. Maximus was an energetic and able man, and one worthy of the throne, had he not risen to it by usurpation, contrary to his oath of allegiance. So given that this is the material Gildas probably based his section on, we can see that he is deliberately poisoning our view of Maximus. I think we should take this as the first in a line of rhetorical attacks on the Northerners, and probably specifically on the House of Cuneda, the royal house of Gwynedd. When we get on to the contemporary section and Gildas's 5 wicked kings, we'll see that at least 2 of them, and possibly the worst of them, were kings from the House of Cuneda. Okay, after this, Britain is robbed of all her armed soldiery, of her military supplies, of her rulers, cruel though they were, and of her vigorous youth who followed the footsteps of the above-mentioned tyrant and never returned. completely ignorant of the practice of war, she is, for the first time, open to be trampled upon by two foreign tribes of extreme cruelty, the Scots from the northwest, the Picts from the north, and for many years continues stunned and groaning. Okay, so Gildas claims that Maximus robbed Britain of all soldiers, supplies and rulers. On the one hand, this is still an attack on Maximus, but on the other, we have to ask, what does that say about the men who, after Maximus had left, claimed to be its soldiers and rulers? He says the Britons were completely ignorant of the practice of war. If the House of Caneda's legitimacy rested on them being the leaders of the soldiers that were given authority over the north by Maximus, this is a direct assault on their right to rule. Note also that Gildas is heavily implying that this was the beginning of problems with the Scots and Picts. We know that isn't true. He doesn't quite say it. He actually says it's the first time Britain is open to be trampled by them. But rhetorically, it's clear that he's saying the Scots and Picts, as a problem, derived from the wicked Maximus and the uselessness of the northern Britons. And yes, he describes this as if it relates to all of Britain, but it's obvious that when he's talking about Scots and Picts, the main impact would be on the north. We can start to see now why Gildas wouldn't have wanted to mention the Romans defeating the Scots and Picts in 368, or Maximus defeating them in 381. He wants to give the impression Maximus is to blame for the Scots and Picts. Incidentally, there's a mild indication here that Gildas has a southern perspective, just because he says the Scots come from the northwest. If he were based in the north, he might just say they come from the west. Of course, the far stronger indication is that he's critical of every single thing the northerners do. We then have a demonstrably ahistorical section on events in the north. Owing to the inroads of these tribes and the consequent dreadful prostration, Britain sends an embassy with letters to Rome, entreating in tearful appeals an armed force to avenge her, and vowing submission on her part to the Roman power, uninterrupted and with all strength of heart, if the enemy were driven away. A legion is forthwith prepared, with no remembrance of past evil, and fully equipped. Having crossed over the sea in ships to Britain, it came into close engagement with the oppressive enemies. It killed a great number of them and drove all over the borders, and freed the humiliated inhabitants from so fierce a violence and threatening bondage. The inhabitants were commanded to build a wall across the island between the two seas, so that when strongly manned, it would be a terror to repel the enemies and a protection to the citizens. The wall, being made not of stone but of turf, proved of no advantage to the rabble in their folly, and destitute of a leader. This is basically a just so story for the building of the Antonine Wall, so we can't take it seriously as history, because that turf wall was built centuries earlier. I think when Gildas talks about the Britons' tearful appeals, he is deliberately aiming to humiliate northerners and toxify the ethnic label of Britain. He doesn't specify that these are northerners carrying out this humiliating appeal, because the core purpose of his work is to destroy the ethnic identity of Britain as a badge of pride for southerners. But I'm certain that he wants his southern readership to respond, "That wasn't us, we never did that, that was those northern bastards." Of course, the northerners would be well within their rights to also say they never did it, because it's obvious to us this is made up. Gildas uses this fantasy resequencing of history to suggest that the Romans, as an act of kindness, agreed to come over and massacre the invaders and free the Britons. The Romans tell the northerners to build a wall between the seas, which, if strongly manned, would repel enemies and protect citizens. Of course, it isn't strongly manned, because the House of Caneda are a useless rabble which fails to provide any serious leadership. Note also that Gildas doesn't think much of the northerners' decision to build a wall out of turf. He deliberately makes this their choice, not to the Romans. The legion returned home in great triumph and joy when their old enemies, like rapacious wolves fierce with excessive hunger, jumped with greedy maw into the fold because there was no shepherd in sight. They rush across the boundaries, carried over by wings of oars, by arms of rowers, and by sails with fair wind. They slay everything, and whatever they meet with, they cut it down like a ripe crop, trample underfoot, and walk through. Gildas here is just making it clear that the northerners provide no resistance whatsoever to the Scots and Picts. This is still the ahistorical bit, so this is all pure Gildas. Don't look here for any history. It's just another opportunity to say Romans good, northerners useless. As usual, Gildas has the Roman army go home at the end of their activity. Again, suppliant messengers are sent with rent clothes, as is said, and heads covered with dust. Crouching like timid fowls under the trusty wings of the parent birds, they ask help of the Romans, lest the country in its wretchedness be completely swept away. and the name of Romans, which to their ears was the echo of a mere word, should even grow vile as a thing gnawed at in the reproach of alien nations. So we're still in Gildas fantasy land, and Gildas is still humiliating the Britons, and Northerners in particular. No reason to think this ever happened. He feels the need to come up with a reason why the Romans would have helped to maintain their reputation, but this is all nonsense. And if we're getting into the 400s, Rome has more than enough on its plate for any of this to make sense. It would be a bad mistake to try to read anything historical into this. Given that Gildas is creating freely here, he sees an opportunity to show off his poetic imagery skills. Massacre poetry is a niche area, but Gildas turns out to be very good at it. They moved as far as was possible for human nature. By the tale of such a tragedy, make speed like the flight of eagles, unexpected in quick movements of cavalry on land and of sailors by sea. Before long they plunge their terrible swords in the necks of the enemies. The massacre they inflict is to be compared to the fall of leaves at the fixed time. Just like a mountain torrent, swollen by numerous streams after storms, sweeps over its bed in its noisy course, with furrowed back and fierce look, its waters, as the saying goes, surging up to the clouds, by which our eyes, though often refreshed by the movements of the eyelids, are obscured by the quick meeting of lines in its broken eddies. Foam surprisingly, with one rush, overcomes obstacles set in its way. This is a reminder that Gildas is a very educated fellow who feels free to use all of his talents to make his case. Then did the illustrious helpers quickly put to flight the hordes of the enemy beyond the sea, if indeed escape was at all possible for them, for it was beyond the seas that they, with no one to resist, heaped up the plunder greedily acquired by them year by year. Again, a reminder that the Northerners in this fantasy had failed to provide any resistance at all, as their goods were stolen. The Romans, therefore, declared to our country that they could not be troubled too frequently by arduous expeditions of that kind, nor could the marks of Roman power, that is, an army of such size and character, be harassed by land and sea on account of unwarlike, roving, thieving fellows. They urged the Britons, rather, to accustom themselves to arms, and fight bravely, so as to save with all their might their land, property, wives, children, and what is greater than these, their liberty and life. They should not, they urge, in any way hold forth their hands armourless to be bound by nations in no way stronger than themselves, unless they became effeminate through indolence and listlessness, but have them provided with bucklers, swords, and spears, and ready for striking. So we get to the point Gildas is leading to, which is why the Romans stopped helping the Britons. He's keen to belittle the threat from Scots and Picts and make it clear that it was only ever the northern Britons being useless that made them a threat. We're still in Gildas's fantasy land, so none of this can be taken as history. We know everything so far has been fantasy, because this is all building up to the Romans finally getting around to building what we call Hadrian's Wall. Because they were also of opinion that it would bring a considerable advantage to the people they were leaving, they construct a wall, different from the other, by public and private contributions. Joining the wretched inhabitants to themselves, they build the wall in their accustomed mode of structure, in a straight line across from sea to sea between cities, which perhaps had been located there through fear of enemies. They give bold counsel to the people in their fear, and leave behind them patterns for the manufacture of arms. Gildas would have been perfectly aware that the wall was far older than he is implying, because Orosius claims Severus built it. Orosius got the emperor wrong, but it would still have been obvious to Gildas that it was far older than he's suggesting. Incidentally, my view is that we should note Gildas's scepticism about a turf wall versus a stone wall. Gildas may well have been writing from within the same cultural zone that either already had built or was in the course of building the Wansdyke turf wall. My suspicion is that Gildas may well be saying that the Wansdyke's all very well, but we're going to need a bigger wall. He even slips in a proposed PFI funding model, saying the stone wall was built by public and private contributions. Now, of course, Gildas cannot possibly have had access to the funding mechanism by which Hadrian's Wall was built. This is all Gildas's imagination, so it's very interesting to see what he comes up with. Also, back in the preface, he justified his writing this work by saying, yes, Britain has Principes et Custodes, but they are bent down under the pressure of so great a weight they have no time to breathe. Might that be a sort of semi-joke based on the idea that they are literally hauling the earth to build the Wansdyke? Gildas's work could then be seen as effectively part of the same project. They build the material wall, he builds the rhetorical wall. He also throws in the building of the Saxon shore forts. On the sea coast, also towards the south, where their ships were wont to anchor because from that quarter also while barbarian hordes were feared, they placed towers at stated intervals, affording a prospect of the sea. They then bid them farewell as men who never intended to return. He has to be very coy here. Again, these forts were built long before the end of Roman rule, but at this point in the text he doesn't want to admit the Saxons are an issue. He must have known they actually were because he dances around the point, but he's holding them in reserve. So he says the towers on the coast were built only because from that quarter also while barbarian hordes were feared. Gildas is basically here admitting the southern defences were nothing to do with the Scots and Picts, but he won't admit what the actual southern antagonist was, because he needs to find a way of blaming the Northerners and the House of Canada for them too. The Romans, as usual, will go home, but this time never to return. This is all fantasy. As they were returning home, the terrible hordes of Scots and Picts eagerly come forth out of the tiny craft in which they sailed across the sea valley, as on oceans deep, just as when the sun is high and the heat increasing, dark swarms of worms emerge from the narrow crevices of their holes, differing partly in their habits, yet alike in one and the same thirst for bloodshed, in a preference also for covering their villainous faces with hair rather than their nakedness of body with decent clothing. These nations, on learning the departure of our helpers and their refusal to return, became more audacious than ever and seized the whole northern part of the land as far as the wall, to the exclusion of the inhabitants. So Gildas is being a little inconsistent here, as he can't quite decide how bad a threat the Scots and Picts were. Last paragraph he said they weren't stronger than the Britons, but now they're terrible hordes which thirst for bloodshed. He also has some fun portraying them as bushy-bearded but naked. Bear in mind that the Scots and Picts of Gildas's day were Christianising, so it's interesting that he portrays them like this without any hint they've changed at all. It's fair to say that Gildas's attack isn't only on British ethnic identity. The Scots and Picts come off even worse. Also note that there's no suggestion that the Scots and Picts are being sent by God to punish anyone. The Northerners at this point are just useless. There's no suggestion yet that they're being punished for sinfulness or anything like that. Gildas has the Scots and Picts now seizing the land north of the wall. The Scots really do settle north of the wall around this vague period, but Gildas must know that Picts at least have been there throughout the Roman period, otherwise what were the walls for? From a historical point of view, Gildas hasn't really told us anything about the post-Roman period yet, although I suppose you could say that the Roman zone just north of the wall has been taken by the Scots and Picts. I mean, maybe that's what he's saying here, but I think that's probably reading a bit too much into it. Now, for the first time, we get hold of some actual historical detail. To oppose their attacks, there was stationed on the height of the stronghold an army slow to fight, unwieldy for flight, incompetent by reason of its cowardice of heart, which languished day and night in its foolish watch. In the meantime, the barbed weapons of the naked enemies are not idle. By them the wretched citizens are dragged from the walls and dashed to the ground. This punishment of untimely death was an advantage, forsooth, to them that were cut off by such an end, insofar as it saved them by its suddenness from the wretched torments which threatened their brethren and relatives. From the House of Canada's point of view, this is probably where they might start the story. Maximus leaves, and they're given control of the wall and the north. Gildas delights in laying into them for failing to hold the wall. This is a pure rhetorical assault on them. Why should I tell more? They abandon their cities and lofty wall. There ensues a repetition of flight on the part of the citizens. Again there are scatterings with less hope than ever, pursuit again by the enemy, and again still more cruel massacres. As lambs by butchers, so the unhappy citizens are torn in pieces by the enemy, insomuch that their life might be compared to that of wild animals. For they even began to restrain one another by the thieving of the small means of sustenance for scanty living, to tide over a short time, which the wretched citizens possessed. Calamities from without were aggravated by tumults at home, because the whole country, by pillagings so frequent of this kind, was being stripped of every kind of food supply, with the exception of the relief that came from their skill in hunting. Now, Gildas talks about the citizens without exactly saying who, but it's obvious he's talking about the north. The Hugh Williams translation obscures this point by using the word country, but the Latin actually says regio, as in region, so it's explicitly the region, as in the north next to the wall, we're talking about here. Incidentally, note that when Gildas is feeling sympathetic, he refers to citizens, and when he's admonishing, he refers to Britons. There's nothing against the citizens of Britain. It's the Britons he can't stand. It's not really the people, it's the identity. So far, post-Rome, all we can say that might be historical is that the House of Canada tried and failed to hold the wall. The Scots and Picts are a menace. That's about it. There's nothing specific about any actual event, just a general sense that the Northern defenders failed. In the next video, we finally get a small dose of historical detail, but it's very important to bear in mind that it's part of the same section, that history here is being used purely for rhetorical purposes.